The rain drummed mercilessly against the pavement of Fifth Avenue, each droplet reflecting the golden glow of the upscale restaurants that lined Manhattan's most prestigious street. Sarah Mitchell pulled her worn coat tighter around her swollen belly, her 7-month pregnancy making each step more labored than the last. The November wind cut through the thin fabric like a blade, and she pressed her back against the brick wall of an alley, seeking momentary shelter from both the storm and the judgmental stares of passers-by. Her stomach churned with hunger, a familiar companion that had been with her for weeks now. The small amount of money she had managed to collect from kind strangers earlier that day had already been spent on a meager sandwich, barely enough to sustain her and the life growing inside her. Sarah's eyes swept across the illuminated windows of Le Bernardin, where well-dressed diners enjoyed their expensive meals without a care in the world. The contrast between their warm, secure world and her cold, uncertain reality felt like an insurmountable chasm. As she watched, a couple emerged from the restaurant, the woman's laughter ringing out like crystal bells in the night air. They climbed into a waiting limousine without even glancing in Sarah's direction. She was invisible to them, just another shadow in the city's countless dark corners. The thought stung more than the rain against her face, reminding her of how far she had fallen from the life she once knew. Inside the restaurant, Richard Harrison sat across from his business associate Marcus Chen, discussing the final details of a merger that would expand his tech empire even further. At 35, Richard had built Harrison Technologies from a small startup into one of the most influential companies in Silicon Alley. His tailored Armani suit and confident demeanor spoke of success, but his sharp blue eyes held a restlessness that wealth couldn't satisfy. The Shanghai deal should close by Friday, Marcus was saying, but Richard's attention had drifted to the window beside their table. Through the rain-streaked glass, he caught sight of a figure huddled in the alley across the street. Even from this distance, he could see she was young and pregnant, her condition making her vulnerability all the more striking. "Richard, did you hear what I said about the quarterly projections?" Marcus's voice pulled him back to the conversation. "Of course," Richard replied automatically, though his gaze kept returning to the window. There was something about the woman that stirred an unfamiliar emotion in his chest. He had grown accustomed to insulating himself from the city's harsh realities, moving through life in a bubble of privilege and power. Yet tonight, something felt different. As their meal concluded, Richard found himself unable to shake the image of the woman in the alley. Marcus excused himself to take a call from his wife, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. He watched as several restaurant patrons exited, their expressions of disgust evident as they noticed the homeless woman nearby. One man actually stepped further into the street to avoid walking near her, muttering something about "these people" ruining the neighborhood. The callousness of it all struck Richard like a physical blow. He thought of his own privileged upbringing, of the security he had always taken for granted. When had he become so disconnected from basic human compassion? The question unsettled him more than any business challenge ever had. After settling the bill, Richard stepped out into the rain, his expensive leather shoes splashing through puddles as he crossed the street. Marcus called after him, confused by his sudden departure, but Richard barely heard him. Something was compelling him forward, a voice inside his head that he couldn't ignore. Sarah looked up as footsteps approached, instinctively tensing for another rejection or harsh word. Instead, she found herself looking into the kindest eyes she had seen in months. The man before her was clearly wealthy, from his perfectly styled dark hair to his expensive coat. Yet there was no judgment in his expression, only genuine concern. "Excuse me," Richard said softly, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Sarah's first instinct was to be suspicious. In her months on the street, she had learned that kindness often came with a price, yet something in this stranger's demeanor felt different, authentic in a way that made her guard lower slightly. "I'm fine," she said, though the words rang hollow even to her own ears. Her voice was hoarse from the cold, and she couldn't stop shivering despite her efforts to appear strong. Richard studied her face, noting the exhaustion etched in every line, the way her hands protectively cradled her belly. "When did you last have a proper meal?" he asked gently. The direct question caught Sarah off guard. She wanted to lie, to maintain what little dignity she had left, but the sincerity in his voice made pretense seem pointless. "This morning," she admitted, though it had been nothing more than half a stale bagel someone had discarded. "There's a 24-hour diner 3 blocks from here," Richard said, pulling out his phone to shield it from the rain. "Would you let me buy you dinner? No strings attached. I can't walk away knowing you're hungry." Sarah hesitated, weighing her options. Every instinct told her to be careful, yet hunger and exhaustion were making her judgment cloudy. The baby shifted inside her, as if responding to the mention of food, and she found herself nodding before she could reconsider. The walk to Murphy's diner was awkward, filled with the kind of silence that comes when two people from completely different worlds find themselves thrust together. Richard offered his umbrella, but Sarah initially refused, not wanting to feel indebted to this stranger. Only when he pointed out that getting sick would hurt her baby did she accept the gesture. Inside the warm, brightly lit diner, the contrast between them became even more apparent. Richard looked perfectly at ease in any environment, while Sarah felt acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, the way other diners' eyes followed her movements with curiosity and judgment. "Order whatever you want," Richard said as they settled into a corner booth, the red vinyl seats creaking under their weight. "And please don't hold back on my account." For the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to truly consider what she wanted rather than what she could afford. The simple act of choosing from a menu without counting every penny felt like a luxury she had forgotten existed. She ordered soup, a sandwich, and a piece of pie, trying not to think about how long it had been since she had eaten her fill. As they waited for the food, Richard found himself studying the woman across from him. Despite her circumstances, there was an intelligence in her green eyes that spoke of better times, of dreams that had been derailed rather than abandoned. Her hands, though roughened by life on the streets, moved with a grace that suggested education and refinement. "I'm Richard," he said, extending his hand across the table. "Richard Harrison." "Sarah," she replied, accepting the handshake. Her grip was firm despite her obvious weakness, another hint at the strength that lay beneath her vulnerable exterior. The food arrived quickly, and Richard watched as Sarah tried to eat with dignity despite her obvious hunger. She paused between bites to thank him, her gratitude genuine and unguarded. It had been years since anyone had looked at Richard with such pure appreciation for a simple kindness. As the evening progressed, their conversation flowed more naturally. Sarah spoke carefully about her situation, revealing that she had been living on the streets for 2 months, sleeping in shelters when space was available and under highway overpasses when it wasn't. The father of her child had disappeared when she told him about the pregnancy, leaving her to face an eviction notice and mounting medical bills alone. "I was a teacher," she said quietly, stirring her coffee with a plastic spoon. "Elementary school, 3rd grade. I loved those kids, but when I couldn't afford my apartment anymore, everything just fell apart." Richard felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of the cruel randomness that separated those who had security from those who didn't. "What happened to your family? Surely someone could help." Sarah's expression darkened, and she looked out the window at the rain that continued to fall. "I don't have anyone. I was raised in foster care, bounced around from home to home. Never really belonged anywhere until I started teaching, and even that wasn't enough when everything went wrong." The weight of her isolation settled over Richard like a heavy cloak. He thought of his own support system, the network of family and friends who would never let him fall so far. The unfairness of it all struck him with unexpected force. When Sarah excused herself to use the restroom, Richard sat alone with his thoughts, trying to process what he was feeling. This wasn't just sympathy or guilt, it was something deeper, more personal. There was something about Sarah that resonated with him on a level he couldn't quite understand, as if meeting her was somehow meant to happen. By the time they left the diner, the rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, and the streets were beginning to empty as midnight approached. Richard knew he should probably call her a cab and send her on her way, but the thought of leaving her to face another night on the streets felt impossible. "I have a guest house on my property in the Hamptons," he heard himself saying before he could reconsider. "It's empty, and you could stay there until you get back on your feet. Just temporarily until the baby comes." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." It was a fair question, one that Richard couldn't fully answer even for himself. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't leave you out here. Not in your condition." As they stood there under the streetlight, two strangers whose lives had intersected in the most unlikely way, neither could have imagined the journey that lay ahead of them, or how this single act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. The drive to Richard's estate in the Hamptons took nearly 2 hours through the dark, rain-slicked highways of Long Island. Sarah sat quietly in the passenger seat of his Tesla, watching the city lights give way to suburban neighborhoods and eventually to the sprawling properties of the wealthy elite. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the soft hum of the engine and the occasional whisper of wind against the windows. Sarah's hands rested protectively over her belly, where the baby seemed to have settled into a peaceful sleep after the warm meal. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this safe, cocooned in the luxury of heated leather seats and the steady presence of someone who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being. It felt almost too good to be true, like a dream from which she might wake at any moment to find herself back on the cold streets. Richard glanced at her occasionally, noting how exhaustion had softened her features. In the dim light of the dashboard, he could see that she was younger than he had initially thought, probably in her mid-20s. There was a delicate beauty about her that the harsh realities of street life hadn't been able to completely erase, like a flower that had managed to bloom despite being planted in hostile soil. "Tell me if you need to stop," he said softly, not wanting to wake her if she had dozed off. "There's no rush." "I'm awake," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just can't believe this is happening. 3 hours ago, I was wondering where I would sleep tonight, and now—" She gestured at the elegant interior of the car, at the promise of warmth and shelter that lay ahead. "Life has a way of surprising us," Richard said, though he was as amazed by the evening's events as she was. He had never been one for spontaneous gestures, preferring the predictability of business deals and calculated risks. Yet here he was, bringing a complete stranger to his most private sanctuary, and it felt more right than any decision he had made in years. As they turned through the imposing iron gates of the Harrison estate, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The property stretched out before them like something from a magazine, all manicured lawns and strategically placed lighting that highlighted ancient oak trees and perfectly maintained gardens. The main house rose majestically from the landscape, a testament to old money and refined taste, while smaller buildings were scattered throughout the grounds like carefully planned afterthoughts. "The guest house is over there," Richard said, pointing to a charming cottage nestled among a grove of birch trees. "It has everything you'll need: kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, even a small nursery that my sister used when she visited with her children." Sarah pressed her face to the window, hardly believing what she was seeing. The cottage looked like something from a fairy tale, with its stone facade and warm light glowing from the windows. It was bigger than any apartment she had ever been able to afford, and the thought That it would be hers, even temporarily, seemed almost impossible to grasp. Richard parked in front of the cottage and hurried around to help Sarah from the car, noting how she moved carefully to protect her swollen belly. The pregnancy was clearly taking its toll on her small frame, and he made a mental note to arrange for proper medical care as soon as possible. Inside, the guest house was even more beautiful than Sarah had imagined. The living room was decorated in warm earth tones, with comfortable furniture arranged around a stone fireplace that Richard immediately set about lighting. The kitchen was small but fully equipped, with a refrigerator that hummed quietly in the corner and cabinets stocked with basic necessities. Mrs. Chen, she's my housekeeper, comes by twice a week to maintain the property, Richard explained as he adjusted the thermostat. I'll ask her to stock the refrigerator tomorrow, but there should be enough here to get you through the night. Sarah walked through the rooms in a daze, running her fingers along the polished surfaces and soft fabrics. The bedroom was spacious and inviting, with a king-sized bed topped with pristine white linens and a window that looked out over the gardens. The bathroom was a study in marble and brass fixtures, with a deep, soaking tub that made her think longingly of hot baths and privacy, but it was the nursery that truly took her breath away. The small room had been decorated in soft pastels, with a white crib positioned near a rocking chair by the window. Someone had taken great care in choosing every detail, from the mobile that hung above the crib to the changing table stocked with supplies that looked barely used. Your sister has good taste, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. Richard joined her in the doorway, his expression growing distant. She did. Elena passed away 2 years ago, cancer. She only got to use this room a few times before. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I'm sorry, Sarah said, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. I can stay somewhere else if this brings back difficult memories. No, Richard said firmly, covering her hand with his own. She would have wanted it to be used by someone who needs it. She was always helping people, always bringing home strays and fighting causes that others ignored. The moment of physical contact lingered between them, both suddenly aware of the intimacy of their situation. Sarah was the first to pull away, confused by the flutter of something unexpected in her chest. This was kindness, nothing more, she told herself. Richard Harrison was a wealthy man helping someone less fortunate, and she couldn't allow herself to read anything else into his gestures. Richard cleared his throat and stepped back into the hallway. I should let you get some rest. Tomorrow, I'd like to arrange for you to see a doctor, just to make sure everything is okay with the pregnancy. I can't ask you to pay for that, Sarah protested, though the thought of proper prenatal care filled her with relief. She hadn't seen a doctor since her second trimester, when she still had insurance through her teaching job. You're not asking, Richard replied with a smile. I'm offering. Consider it part of the hospitality package. After Richard left, promising to return in the morning, Sarah stood alone in the living room, trying to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. The fire crackled softly in the grate, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and for the first time in months, she felt truly warm. She made herself a cup of tea with supplies she found in the kitchen, then settled into the comfortable armchair by the window to watch the last of the rain fade away. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing the change in environment, and Sarah placed both hands over her belly. It's okay, little one, she whispered. We're safe now, at least for a while. As she prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror and was startled by her appearance. The woman looking back at her had hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes, with hair that hadn't seen a proper salon in months. Tomorrow, she promised herself, she would find a way to look more presentable. Richard's kindness deserved better than a charity case who couldn't even manage basic grooming. The hot shower felt like a revelation after weeks of cold water in public restrooms and homeless shelters. Sarah stood under the spray until her skin was pink and warm, washing away not just the grime of street life, but some of the despair that had clung to her like a second skin. The shampoo smelled like lavender, and the towels were so soft they felt like clouds against her skin. In the bedroom, she found a set of clean pajamas that someone had left in the dresser, simple cotton pieces that fit her expanded figure perfectly. As she slipped between the crisp sheets, Sarah felt tears of gratitude roll down her cheeks. The mattress cradled her aching body like a gentle embrace, and the pillows smelled faintly of fabric softener and sunshine. Sleep came quickly for the first time in months, deep and dreamless. Sarah's last conscious thought was of Richard's kind eyes and the way he had looked at her, not with pity, but with something that almost resembled respect. She didn't dare hope that this sanctuary would last, but for tonight she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of better days ahead. Meanwhile, back at the main house, Richard stood at his bedroom window, looking across the grounds toward the guest cottage. The lights had been turned off, suggesting that Sarah had settled in for the night, and he found himself hoping that she was sleeping peacefully. The evening had affected him in ways he couldn't quite understand, awakening feelings of protectiveness and purpose that had been dormant for years. He thought about Elena and how proud she would have been of his decision to help Sarah. His sister had always accused him of being too focused on business, too disconnected from the human elements of life. Perhaps she'd been right, and perhaps meeting Sarah was exactly the wake-up call he needed. As Richard prepared for bed, he found himself looking forward to the next day with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. There were arrangements to be made, people to call, plans to put in motion. For the first time since Elena's passing, he had something meaningful to focus on beyond profit margins and market shares. He had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to unravel secrets that would change everything he thought he knew about family, love, and the intricate connections that bind lives together in ways both beautiful and terrifying. Dr. Amanda Foster's medical office on the Upper East Side was everything Sarah had dreamed of during her months without proper health care. The waiting room was decorated in soothing blues and greens, with comfortable chairs and magazines that weren't months out of date. Classical music played softly in the background, and the receptionist had greeted her with genuine warmth rather than the suspicious looks she had grown accustomed to receiving. Richard sat beside her, his presence both comforting and slightly overwhelming. He had insisted on accompanying her to the appointment, claiming he wanted to ensure she received the best possible care. Sarah suspected there was more to it than that. In the 3 days since she had moved into the guest house, she had noticed the way he found excuses to check on her, bringing fresh groceries or simply stopping by to chat about inconsequential things. Sarah Mitchell, a nurse, appeared at the door, clipboard in hand and a professional smile on her face. As they were led back to the examination room, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. It had been nearly 3 months since her last ultrasound, and the uncertainty about her baby's health had been a constant source of worry during her time on the streets. Poor nutrition and stress weren't exactly ideal conditions for pregnancy, and she feared what the tests might reveal. Dr. Foster was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes that immediately put Sarah at ease. She conducted a thorough examination, asking detailed questions about Sarah's medical history and the challenges she had faced during her pregnancy. Richard waited in the outer room, giving Sarah the privacy she needed while remaining close enough to provide support. "Your blood pressure is a bit high, but that's not uncommon given your circumstances," Dr. Foster explained as she prepared the ultrasound equipment. "The baby's positioning feels good, and your measurements are right on track for 30 weeks. Let's take a look and see how your little one is doing." The ultrasound screen flickered to life, showing the grainy black and white image that had become familiar to expectant mothers around the world. Sarah held her breath as Dr. Foster moved the wand across her belly, painting a picture of her unborn child with sound waves and technology. "Everything looks perfect, Dr. Foster announced with a smile. "Good heart rate, proper development, and—" She paused, adjusting the angle of the ultrasound probe. "Oh, that's interesting. What is it?" Sarah asked, a spike of fear shooting through her chest. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all," Dr. Foster assured her quickly. "It's just that your baby has a very distinctive birthmark. See this area here on the neck?" She pointed to a small, star-shaped marking visible on the ultrasound image. "It's quite beautiful, actually. Birthmarks like this are relatively rare." Sarah stared at the screen, memorizing every detail of her baby's face and form. The star-shaped mark was clearly visible, a small but distinct feature that would make her child unique. "Is it something that will fade as the baby grows?" "Some birthmarks do fade, but this type typically remains throughout life," Dr. Foster explained. "It's nothing to be concerned about, just one of those special characteristics that make each baby individual." After the appointment concluded with reassurances about Sarah's health and detailed instructions for the remaining weeks of pregnancy, she and Richard walked to his car in comfortable silence. The ultrasound photos were tucked safely in Sarah's purse, physical proof of the life growing inside her and the promise of a future that suddenly seemed brighter than it had in months. "The baby looks healthy," Richard said as they settled into the car. "Dr. Foster seems very pleased with how everything is progressing." "I can't thank you enough for this," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Knowing that everything is okay, it's the best gift I could have asked for." Richard started the engine but didn't immediately pull into traffic. Instead, he sat quietly, his hands gripping the steering wheel with unusual tension. Something about the appointment had affected him deeply, though Sarah couldn't understand what might have caused such a reaction to routine medical care. "Richard, is everything all right?" she asked, noting the distant look in his eyes. "The birthmark," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The star-shaped mark on the baby's neck. What about it?" "Doctor Foster said it was nothing to worry about." Richard turned to face her, and Sarah was startled by the intensity of his expression. "My sister Eleanor had a birthmark exactly like that. Same shape, same location. I remember it so clearly because our mother used to call it Elena's lucky star." Sarah felt a chill run through her despite the warm air flowing from the car's heater. That's quite a coincidence." "Is it?" Richard asked, his voice taking on an urgent quality. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I know it might sound strange. What do you know about your family history? Your biological parents?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow, stirring up memories and pain she had spent years trying to bury. "I told you I grew up in foster care. I never knew my parents, never had any information about them beyond the fact that I was abandoned at a hospital when I was barely a year old." "What was the name on your birth certificate? Do you remember where you were born?" Sarah's hands began to tremble as she reached for her purse, pulling out the worn wallet that contained her most important documents. Her birth certificate was there, creased and yellowed with age, bearing the stark facts of her entry into the world. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, born at Presbyterian Hospital in Brooklyn on March 15, 1998. Richard's face went pale as he processed this information. Elena was born in 1997, but she was adopted when she was 2 years old. Our parents, the Harrisons, they never had biological children. Elena came to them through a private adoption agency, and there were always questions about her background, about whether she might have had siblings who were separated during the adoption process. The implications of what he was suggesting began to dawn on Sarah, and she felt the world tilt dangerously around her. "You think we might be related? That's impossible." "Is it?" Richard pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos until he found one of Elena taken just months before her passing. "Look at her features, Sarah. Really look." Sarah stared at the image, seeing a woman with her same green eyes, the same delicate bone structure, the same auburn hair that caught the light in precisely the same way. The resemblance was undeniable, so strong that they could have been sisters or even twins, separated by a year of age and decades of different experiences. "This doesn't prove anything," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Lots of people share similar features. The birthmark could be a coincidence." "Maybe," Richard agreed, but his expression suggested he didn't believe in coincidences of this magnitude. "But wouldn't you want to know for certain? Wouldn't you want to understand your family history, especially now that you're about to have a child of your own?" The drive back to the Hamptons passed in contemplative silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts as they processed the day's revelations. Sarah found herself staring at the ultrasound photos, focusing on the tiny star-shaped mark that might be more significant than she had ever imagined. The idea that she might have found family, real blood relatives after years of believing she was completely alone in the world, was both thrilling and terrifying. Richard, meanwhile, was grappling with emotions he couldn't quite name. If Sarah was indeed Elena's sister, then the feelings he had been developing for her took on a complexity that made his chest tighten with anxiety. He had felt drawn to her from the moment they met, attracted not just to her beauty, but to her strength and resilience. The possibility that they might be connected by family ties rather than romantic potential left him feeling confused and unsettled. Back at the estate, they sat in the guest house living room, the fire crackling softly as they continued their conversation. Sarah had changed into comfortable clothes and made tea for both of them. Small domestic gestures that had become natural over the past few days. "If we were to pursue this," Sarah said carefully, "how would we find out for certain?" "DNA testing," Richard replied immediately. "I still have some of Elena's personal items, things with hair follicles that could be used for comparison. It would take a couple of weeks to get results, but it would give us definitive answers. And if the tests show we are related, what then?" It was a question Richard had been asking himself for hours, and he still didn't have a satisfactory answer. "Then we would deal with whatever that means, I suppose. You would have family, real biological connections. Your baby would have an uncle, grandparents, who might still be alive somewhere." Sarah set down her teacup and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens that had become her temporary sanctuary. The possibility of having family was something she had dreamed about for years, but now that it might be within reach, she found herself afraid of what it might mean for the life she was trying to build. "What if the connection changes things between us?" she asked quietly, not turning around to face him. "What if finding out we're family makes everything complicated?" Richard joined her at the window, close enough to catch the faint scent of the lavender shampoo she had been using. "Then we'll figure it out together. Whatever the results show, it doesn't change the fact that you needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. It doesn't change the fact that you're important to me." The weight of unspoken feelings hung in the air between them, complicated by the possibility that their connection might be deeper and more complex than either had imagined. As they stood together in the gathering dusk, both wondered if the pursuit of truth would bring them closer together or drive them irrevocably apart. The 2 weeks that followed felt like an eternity, suspended between hope and dread. Sarah had settled into a comfortable routine at the guest house, spending her mornings reading in the sun-filled living room and her afternoons taking gentle walks through the manicured gardens. Richard visited daily, sometimes bringing work documents that provided an excuse for his presence, other times simply appearing with coffee or fresh flowers from the estate's greenhouse. Their conversations had taken on a careful quality since the DNA samples had been sent to the laboratory. Both were acutely aware of the unspoken feelings that had been developing between them, emotions that could be either validated or completely complicated by the test results. The attraction was undeniable. The way Richard's eyes lingered on Sarah's face when he thought she wasn't looking, the way her pulse quickened when he sat close enough for their hands to accidentally touch. On a crisp December morning, Richard's phone rang while he was reviewing quarterly reports in his home office. The caller ID showed the number for Genesis Laboratories, and his stomach immediately clenched with anticipation. "Mr. Harrison, this is Dr. Patricia Wells from Genesis Labs. I have the DNA comparison results you requested." "Yes, please," Richard said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. He had been preparing for this call for days, yet now that it had arrived, he felt completely unprepared for whatever truth it might reveal. "The samples you provided show a familial match. Based on the genetic markers we tested, there is a 99.7% probability that Sarah Mitchell and Eleanor Harrison were siblings, full siblings to be precise." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, confirming what he had both expected and dreaded. Sarah was Elena's sister, which made her his sister by adoption. The feelings he had been developing for her were not just complicated, they were completely inappropriate. "Are you certain?" he asked, though he knew the science behind DNA testing was virtually infallible. "Absolutely certain, Mr. Harrison. The genetic markers are conclusive. I'll be sending the full report to your email within the hour." After ending the call, Richard sat in his office for a long time, staring out at the guest house where Sarah was undoubtedly going about her morning routine, unaware that their world was about to shift dramatically. He thought about Elena, about the sister she had never known she had, about the cruel irony of Sarah finding family only after Elena was gone. But more than anything, he thought about how he was going to tell Sarah that the feelings he had been struggling with were feelings he should never have entertained. Sarah was in the nursery, folding tiny clothes that Mrs. Chen had brought from a shopping trip in the city, when Richard knocked on the cottage door. She had been expecting him. He usually arrived around 10 o'clock with some excuse for checking on her welfare. But something in his expression immediately told her that this visit was different. "The results came in," he said without preamble, his usual warmth replaced by a careful formality that made Sarah's chest tighten with apprehension. "And?" she asked, though her voice came out barely above a whisper. "You and Eleanor were sisters, full biological siblings." Sarah sank into the rocking chair, her hands instinctively moving to cradle her belly as she processed this information. She had thought she was prepared for this possibility, but hearing it confirmed brought a rush of emotions that left her feeling dizzy and overwhelmed. "So we're family," she said quietly. "You're my brother-in-law. My baby will have an uncle." "Yes," Richard replied, though the words seemed to stick in his throat. "I've been thinking about what this means, practically speaking. You'll want to know about Elena, about her life and her childhood. There are photo albums, videos from family holidays, and my parents, your adoptive parents, they're retired in Florida, but they would want to meet you." Sarah nodded, trying to focus on the practical implications rather than the emotional turmoil she could see in Richard's eyes. "This changes things between us, doesn't it?" "It has to," Richard said firmly. "Whatever we were beginning to feel, it's not appropriate anymore. You're family now, and I need to treat you as such." The words were meant to establish boundaries, but they had the opposite effect of acknowledging that there had indeed been feelings developing between them. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and loss. In the span of a few weeks, she had found safety, kindness, and the possibility of love, only to have that last element stripped away by biology and social convention. "Of course," she agreed, though her voice betrayed the disappointment she was trying to hide. "Family, that's what I always wanted anyway." Over the following days, Richard threw himself into the role of protective brother-in-law with an intensity that felt almost forced. He arranged for Sarah to meet with lawyers who could help her navigate the complexities of establishing her legal identity as Elena's sister. He showed her photo albums filled with images of the sister she had never known, telling stories of Elena's childhood and the vibrant woman she had become. Sarah absorbed it all with gratitude and growing sadness. Elena had lived the life she had always dreamed of, surrounded by family who loved her, educated at the best schools, free to pursue her passions without the constant worry of survival. Looking at photos of Elena's wedding, her graduation from Columbia, her work with various charities, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what her own life might have been like if they had been raised together. "She would have looked for you," Richard said one evening, as they sat in the main house library, surrounded by Elena's books and personal belongings. "If she had known you existed, she would have moved heaven and earth to find you." "But she didn't know," Sarah replied, running her fingers along the spine of a poetry collection Eleanor had apparently loved. "And now she never will." It was Richard who suggested they investigate further into their family history, partly to give Sarah a fuller picture of where she came from, and partly to distract himself from the growing tension of their situation. The adoption agency that had handled Elena's placement proved to be a dead end. Their records had been destroyed in a fire years earlier. But Richard had resources, connections that could open doors that remained closed to ordinary people. The private investigator he hired, Marcus Torres, was discreet and thorough. Within a week, he had uncovered information that neither Richard nor Sarah had expected to find. The woman listed as their mother on various documents, Margaret Sullivan, was still alive, living in a modest apartment in Queens and working as a hospital administrator. But more surprising was Marcus's discovery that Margaret Sullivan had never given birth to biological children of her own. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah said, as they reviewed Marcus's report in Richard's home office. "If she's not our biological mother, then how are Elena and I sisters? There are several possibilities," Marcus explained during a conference call. "The most likely scenario is that Margaret Sullivan was involved in some kind of informal adoption network, taking in children who needed homes and then placing them with families through private arrangements. It was more common in the 70s and 80s than people realize." Richard felt something shift in his chest as the implications of this information began to dawn on him. "Are you saying that Eleanor and Sarah might not actually be biological siblings?" "I'm saying we need to run additional tests to be certain of the genetic relationship. The initial test confirmed a familial connection, but there are degrees of family relationship that could account for the results we saw." The second round of DNA testing felt different from the first. Where before they had been seeking confirmation of a suspected truth, now they were questioning everything they thought they knew. Sarah found herself caught between hope and fear, uncertain whether she wanted the tests to confirm or deny the sisterly bond she had begun to embrace. When the results came back, Dr. Wells's voice carried a note of professional embarrassment. "I need to apologize, Mr. Harrison. Our initial interpretation of the genetic markers was incorrect. While there is definitely a familial connection between the two samples, it's more distant than we first reported. The subjects appear to be cousins, not siblings, which suggests they share grandparents, but not parents." "Cousins?" Richard repeated, his voice barely controlled. "Yes, first cousins to be precise. Still family, but a much more distant relationship than our initial assessment indicated. I'm sorry for the confusion. We're implementing new quality control measures to prevent this kind of error in the future." After the call ended, Richard and Sarah sat in silence, both trying to process what this new information meant for their understanding of themselves and each other. The familial connection was still there, still real, but the social and emotional barriers it had created were suddenly less absolute. "Cousins," Sarah said finally, testing the word on her tongue. "That's still family, but it's different," Richard finished for her. "Less complicated." The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility, the careful boundaries they had constructed over the past week suddenly seeming unnecessary and artificial. The attraction they had been so carefully suppressing rushed back with unexpected force, no longer forbidden, but not entirely simple either. Sarah stood up from her chair and walked to the window, looking out over the grounds that had become her sanctuary. What does this mean for us, Richard? For what we were beginning to feel before we knew about the family connection? Richard joined her at the window, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know that what I feel for you hasn't changed, regardless of whether we're family or not. I care about you, Sarah. I care about your baby. I want you both to be safe and happy." "Is that all?" she asked quietly, turning to face him. "Is that the only thing you feel?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with hope and risk, and the possibility of something neither had dared to name. Richard's hand came up to cup Sarah's face, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her cheekbone as he searched her eyes for permission, for confirmation that he wasn't alone in the feelings that had been growing stronger with each passing day. "No," he said finally. "It's not the only thing I feel." When he kissed her, it was with the tenderness of someone who had been holding back for too long, and the passion of someone who finally felt free to express feelings that had been burning just beneath the surface. Sarah melted into his embrace, her hands finding the solid warmth of his chest as she allowed herself to believe, for the first time in her life, that she deserved to be loved and cherished by someone extraordinary. The winter months passed in a blur of happiness that Sarah had never experienced before. Her relationship with Richard deepened with each passing day, built on a foundation of genuine affection, shared experiences, and the unique bond of having found each other when both needed it most. He moved her into the main house during her final month of pregnancy, insisting that she should be closer to help when the baby arrived. Sarah's delivery, on a snowy February morning, was everything she had dreamed it would be during those long, frightening months when she had faced the prospect of giving birth alone. Richard held her hand through every contraction, his presence steady and reassuring as she brought their daughter into the world. For that was how they both thought of baby Emma now, as theirs together rather than just Sarah's alone. Emma Harrison Mitchell was born with a perfect star-shaped birthmark on her neck, just as the ultrasound had predicted. But more than that, she was born into a family that wanted her, into a world of security and love that would shield her from the harsh realities her mother had faced. "She's beautiful," Richard whispered as he held his daughter for the first time, his strong hands gentle as he supported her tiny head. "She's absolutely perfect." Sarah watched from her hospital bed, exhausted but happier than she had ever been in her life. The sight of Richard cradling Emma with such tenderness and awe filled her with a contentment that seemed to radiate from her very core. This was what family looked like, she realized. This was what she had been searching for all her life without even knowing it. The proposal came 6 weeks later, on a warm spring evening, when the estate's gardens were beginning to bloom with the promise of new life. Richard had arranged for Mrs. Chen to watch Emma while he and Sarah took a walk along the paths they had traversed so many times during her recovery from childbirth. "I know we haven't been together very long," he said, as they paused beside the fountain that served as the centerpiece of the formal garden. "And I know that our beginning was unconventional. But Sarah, I can't imagine my life without you and Emma in it." He dropped to one knee, right there among the roses, pulling out a vintage engagement ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "Will you marry me? Will you let me be Emma's father in every way that matters? And will you be my wife?" Sarah's tears of joy were answer enough, but she managed to whisper yes through her overwhelming emotion as Richard slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting her entire life to find its proper home. The wedding took place in September, when Emma was 7 months old and beginning to charm everyone with her bright smiles and gurgling laughter. They held the ceremony in the estate's gardens, with Emma serving as an honorary flower girl carried down the aisle by Mrs. Chen. Sarah's wedding dress was a masterpiece of understated elegance, chosen to complement rather than overshadow the natural beauty of the setting. Richard's business associates and social contacts filled one side of the seating area, while Sarah's side was occupied by the few friends she had managed to maintain contact with during her difficult period, and the staff members from Richard's various properties who had become like family to her. It wasn't a large wedding by society standards, but it was filled with genuine warmth and celebration. The reception that followed was everything Sarah had dreamed a wedding should be. She danced with her new husband under twinkling lights strung between ancient oak trees, surrounded by people who genuinely wished them well. Emma slept peacefully in a bassinet decorated with white roses, occasionally stirring to remind everyone of the love that had brought this unusual family together. It was during the reception that Sarah first became aware of Victoria Sterling, though at the time she seemed like nothing more than another of Richard's business associates offering polite congratulations. Victoria was stunning in the way that only money and breeding could create. Tall, blonde, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from never having wanted for anything. "Richard, congratulations," Victoria said, as she approached the newlyweds during a quiet moment between dances. "What a lovely ceremony, so intimate." There was something in the way she said the word intimate that made Sarah's skin prickle with unease, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what bothered her about the woman's tone. "Thank you, Victoria," Richard replied politely. "I don't believe you've met my wife. Sarah, this is Victoria Sterling. We served together on the board of the Metropolitan Children's Foundation." "How nice to meet you," Sarah said, extending her hand with a smile that Victoria returned with perfect social grace. "The pleasure is mine," Victoria replied, though her eyes remained cool and calculating as they assessed Sarah from head to toe. "Richard has been so secretive about his personal life lately. We were all beginning to wonder what had captured his attention so completely." The conversation was brief and superficial, but it left Sarah with an uncomfortable feeling that lingered throughout the rest of the evening. There had been something possessive in the way Victoria looked at Richard, something territorial that suggested their relationship might have been more than just professional collegiality. "Who is Victoria Sterling, really?" Sarah asked Richard later that night as they prepared for bed in the honeymoon suite he had arranged at the Plaza Hotel. "She's on several charity boards with me," Richard replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Her family has old money, real estate mostly. Why do you ask?" "I just got the feeling that I don't know, that she might have expected things to develop differently between you two." Richard paused in the act of removing his cufflinks, his expression growing thoughtful. "Victoria and I went out a few times, maybe 2 years ago. Nothing serious, just a couple of charity galas and business dinners. She may have had different expectations than I did about where it might lead." "And now she's seeing you married to someone else," Sarah said, beginning to understand the source of her discomfort. "Now she's seeing me married to the woman I love," Richard corrected gently, pulling Sarah into his arms. "Victoria Sterling is part of a world I used to think mattered to me, but that was before I understood what really makes life worth living." The weeks following the wedding were a period of adjustment as Sarah settled into her new role as Mrs. Richard Harrison. The social obligations that came with marrying into New York's elite were daunting at first. Charity luncheons, gallery openings, fundraising galas where she was expected to make polite conversation with people who had never faced real hardship in their lives. Emma thrived in her new environment, attended by a nanny who helped Sarah navigate the challenges of early motherhood while still allowing her to be the primary caregiver. The baby's laughter filled the mansion with a joy that seemed to awaken something that had been sleeping in the grand rooms for too long. It was at a fundraising gala for the Metropolitan Children's Foundation that Sarah first sensed the undercurrents of gossip and speculation that swirled around her marriage. She overheard whispered conversations in the ladies' room, fragments of discussion about her mysterious past, and questions about how she had captured Richard Harrison so completely. Victoria Sterling seemed to be at the center of many of these conversations, never saying anything explicitly critical, but asking leading questions that encouraged others to speculate about Sarah's background and motives. "I just think it's wonderful how Richard has embraced his role as a stepfather," Victoria was saying to a group of women as Sarah approached their table. "Though I do wonder about the child's real father. Surely he must have some legal rights. The baby's father signed away his parental rights before Emma was born," Sarah said quietly, having overheard enough to understand the direction of the conversation. "Richard adopted her legally after we married." Victoria turned with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sarah, how lovely to see you. I was just telling everyone how admirable it is that Richard has taken on such responsibilities." The word responsibilities hung in the air like an accusation, implying that Emma was somehow a burden rather than a blessing. Sarah felt her cheeks flush with anger, but she maintained her composure, remembering Richard's advice about not letting people see how their barbs affected her. "Emma isn't a responsibility," Sarah replied evenly. "She's our daughter, and Richard loves her as much as any biological father could." The conversation moved on to safer topics, but the damage was done. Sarah could see the speculative looks, the way people reassessed her with new interest in light of Victoria's carefully planted suggestions. She began to understand that her integration into Richard's world wouldn't be as simple as she had hoped. That night, she shared her concerns with Richard as they prepared for bed. "I think Victoria Sterling is deliberately trying to cause problems for us. The questions she asks, the things she implies, it all seems designed to make people doubt my motives for marrying you." Richard's jaw tightened as he listened to Sarah's account of the evening's interactions. "Victoria has always been used to getting what she wants. I should have realized that my marriage might not sit well with her. What are we going to do about it? We're going to live our lives and be happy," Richard said firmly, pulling Sarah close. "Victoria can spread all the gossip she wants, but it doesn't change the truth about who we are or what we mean to each other." But even as he spoke those confident words, Richard felt a chill of unease. He knew Victoria Sterling better than he had admitted to Sarah, and he knew that when Victoria set her sights on something she wanted, she could be both persistent and ruthless. His marriage to Sarah had clearly threatened Victoria's long-term plans, and he suspected that the subtle campaign of gossip and innuendo was only the beginning of her efforts to drive them apart. In her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Victoria Sterling sat at her antique writing desk, reviewing the business card of a private investigator that a friend had recommended. Thomas Blake specialized in discreet inquiries for wealthy clients who needed sensitive information handled carefully. She had spent months watching Richard Harrison fall under the spell of a homeless woman with a mysterious past, and his marriage to Sarah had been a public humiliation that Victoria had no intention of accepting quietly. If Richard thought he could dismiss her so easily in favor of a nobody with dubious credentials, he was about to learn just how expensive that mistake could be. Thomas Blake's office in Midtown Manhattan was exactly what Victoria Sterling had expected from a high-end private investigator, understated, professional, with the kind of discreet security that wealthy clients demanded. Blake himself was a former FBI agent who specialized in background investigations for corporate executives and high-profile individuals who needed to know exactly who they were dealing with. "I want to know everything about Sarah Mitchell Harrison," Victoria said, sliding a thick envelope across Blake's mahogany desk. "Her real background, her family history, the circumstances that led her to my husband, I mean, to Richard Harrison." Blake noted the slip, but made no comment as he opened the envelope and counted the substantial retainer fee. "Mrs. Sterling, investigations of this nature can sometimes uncover information that clients find uncomfortable. Are you prepared for the possibility that what we discover might not align with your expectations? Mr. Blake, I'm prepared for anything that will help me understand how a homeless woman managed to manipulate one of New York's most eligible bachelors into marriage, Victoria replied coldly. No stone unturned, no detail too small. The investigation took 3 weeks to complete, and when Blake presented his findings, even Victoria was surprised by the complexity of what he had uncovered. Sarah's story was more tragic and more complicated than anyone had realized, involving a network of informal adoptions, separated siblings, and a biological father who had recently resurfaced with renewed interest in his daughter's life. The most interesting discovery, Blake explained as he spread photographs and documents across his desk, is this woman. He pointed to a surveillance photo of a young woman who looked virtually identical to Sarah. Samantha Mitchell, currently living in Boston and working as a freelance graphic designer. According to hospital records I was able to access, she and Sarah Mitchell Harrison are identical twins, separated shortly after birth and placed in different foster care systems. Victoria studied the photograph with growing excitement. The resemblance was so perfect that even someone who knew Sarah well might have difficulty telling them apart. Does Sarah know about her sister? There's no evidence that either twin is aware of the other's existence, Blake replied. The separation appears to have been deliberate, possibly to make it easier to place them in different homes. But the most damaging information Blake had uncovered concerned Emma's biological father, David Rodriguez, a construction worker from Queens who had recently learned about his daughter's existence through mutual acquaintances who had seen news coverage of Richard Harrison's wedding. Rodriguez has been asking questions about gaining access to his daughter, Blake continued. He claims he never knew Sarah was pregnant when they broke up, and that he never signed any papers relinquishing his parental rights. Victoria's smile was predatory as she absorbed this information. Here were all the weapons she needed to destroy Sarah's carefully constructed new life. A biological father with potential legal claims, a mysterious twin sister, and a past filled with the kind of instability that would horrify Richard's wealthy social circle. I want you to make contact with both of them, Victoria instructed. The twin sister and the biological father. But carefully, I don't want this traced back to me. Meanwhile, Sarah was struggling with challenges she had never anticipated as the wife of a prominent businessman. The social expectations, the constant scrutiny, and the subtle hostility from some of Richard's associates were wearing on her nerves. She found herself questioning every decision, from how she dressed for public events to how she interacted with Emma in front of others. The breaking point came during a charity luncheon where Victoria Sterling had arranged for several of New York's most influential socialites to subtly interrogate Sarah about her background. The questions came disguised as friendly interest, but their intent was unmistakable. "So tell us about your family, Sarah," said Margaret Whitfield, the wife of a prominent federal judge. "Richard mentioned you were raised in foster care, but surely you have some connection to your biological relatives." "I'm afraid not," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was abandoned as a baby and never had any information about my birth family." "How fascinating," Victoria interjected smoothly. "It must be difficult, not knowing your medical history or genetic background, especially with a child of your own to consider." The conversation continued in this vein for nearly an hour, each woman taking turns to probe different aspects of Sarah's past while maintaining the pretense of social pleasantries. By the time the luncheon ended, Sarah felt emotionally bruised and exhausted. That evening, she confronted Richard about the situation. "I think Victoria is orchestrating these attacks on me. The questions are too coordinated, too pointed to be coincidental." Richard set down his wineglass and pulled Sarah into his arms, noting the tension in her shoulders and the exhaustion in her eyes. "What kind of questions are they asking?" "About my past," About Emma's father, about why you would marry someone with such a questionable background. Victoria acts like she's defending me, but every comment she makes just reinforces their doubts about my motives. I'll talk to Victoria, Richard said firmly. This needs to stop. But Victoria Sterling had no intention of stopping. In fact, she was just getting started. The next phase of her plan involved making direct contact with Samantha Mitchell, the twin sister who could potentially be convinced to help destroy Sarah's marriage from the inside. Samantha was working late in her Boston apartment when she received the phone call that would change her life forever. The voice on the other end claimed to be calling on behalf of a wealthy client who had information about Samantha's biological family. "I understand this might be shocking," the caller said, "but we have reason to believe you have an identical twin sister who was separated from you at birth. She's currently living in New York, and our client thought you might be interested in making contact." The revelation hit Samantha like a physical blow. She had always known she was adopted, had always wondered about potential siblings, but the foster care system had provided no information about her origins. The possibility that she had an identical twin, someone who shared her exact genetic makeup and possibly her experiences of growing up without family, filled her with a desperate longing she had thought she had buried years ago. "What do you need from me?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Within days, Samantha had traveled to New York and was sitting in Victoria Sterling's penthouse apartment, staring at photographs of her sister's wedding and life with Richard Harrison. The luxury of Sarah's new existence was both inspiring and deeply painful. Here was everything Samantha had ever dreamed of having, being lived by someone who was genetically identical to her. "I want to help you connect with your sister," Victoria explained, her tone carefully modulated to sound sympathetic. "But there are complications. Sarah's marriage is under tremendous pressure right now. There are questions about her past, concerns about her stability. Meeting you might be overwhelming for her at this delicate time." "What are you suggesting?" Samantha asked, though she was beginning to sense the direction of Victoria's thoughts. "What if you could observe her first, get to know her life and her challenges before revealing yourself? You could pose as her temporarily, just long enough to understand what she's going through and how you might be able to help." The plan Victoria outlined was seemingly designed to protect Sarah while satisfying Samantha's desperate need to connect with her twin. Samantha would spend a few days studying Sarah's routines, her relationships, her daily life. Then she would approach Richard during a time when Sarah was away, explain the situation, and arrange for a proper reunion. What Victoria didn't reveal was that she intended to use this period of observation to plant seeds of doubt in Richard's mind about his wife's behavior, or that she planned to separate the twins rather than reunite them. Meanwhile, David Rodriguez was receiving his own carefully orchestrated contact from Victoria's network. A lawyer claiming to represent his interests had reached out with information about his daughter and suggestions about his legal rights as Emma's biological father. "Your parental rights were never properly terminated," the lawyer explained during their meeting in a Queen's diner. "The adoption that Richard Harrison completed may not be legally binding. With the right legal approach, you could gain visitation rights, possibly even joint custody." David studied the photographs of Emma that the lawyer had provided, seeing his own features reflected in the baby's face. The idea that his daughter was being raised by strangers in a world of privilege he could never provide filled him with a complex mixture of longing and resentment. "What would I need to do?" he asked. As spring turned to summer, the various elements of Victoria's plan began to converge on Sarah's carefully constructed new life. Samantha Mitchell was in place, studying her sister's routines and beginning to feel both protective of and envious toward the woman who had found everything she had always wanted. David Rodriguez was consulting with lawyers about his parental rights, encouraged by legal advisors who assured him he had strong grounds for a custody challenge. And Victoria Sterling was patiently waiting for the perfect moment to set all her carefully placed pieces into motion, confident that when the smoke cleared, Richard Harrison would finally understand that his brief marriage to a homeless woman had been the mistake she had always known it to be. Sarah, unaware of the storm gathering around her, was enjoying what she thought might be the happiest period of her life. Emma was thriving. Richard was more attentive and loving than ever, and even the social challenges seemed to be becoming more manageable as she learned to navigate the complex world of New York's elite. She had no idea that her entire world was about to be turned upside down by the very family connections she had always longed to find. The plan went into motion on a humid July morning when Sarah received a call requesting her presence at an emergency meeting of the Children's Foundation Board. The timing was perfect. Richard was in London on business, Emma was with her nanny, and Sarah would be away from the estate for several hours. Samantha Mitchell stood in the marble foyer of the Harrison mansion, her heart pounding as she prepared to step into her sister's life. The resemblance was so perfect that even Mrs. Chen, who had known Sarah for nearly a year, greeted her with nothing more than a comment about how refreshed she looked after her meeting. The initial plan had been simple. Samantha would pose as Sarah for just a few hours, long enough to understand her sister's daily routine, and perhaps have a conversation with Richard about revealing the truth. But as the days passed and Richard remained away on business, Samantha found herself drawn deeper into the life she was temporarily inhabiting. Everything about Sarah's existence fascinated her. The luxury of the estate, the way the staff treated her with respect and affection, the security of knowing that every need would be met without question. Most compelling of all was Emma, the niece she had never known existed, whose bright smiles and gurgling laughter awakened maternal instincts Samantha had never experienced. When Richard returned from London, Samantha made a decision that would change everything. Instead of revealing the truth immediately, she chose to continue the deception, telling herself that she needed more time to find the right way to explain the situation. "You look different," Richard said as he kissed what he thought was his wife. "Rested. The time apart was good for you." "It was," Samantha replied, her voice carefully modulated to match the speech pattern she had observed in old videos of Sarah. "I missed you." As the days turned into a week, Samantha found herself falling in love with the life she was living. She cared for Emma with growing attachment, managed the household with efficiency that impressed Mrs. Chen, and most dangerously of all, began to develop genuine feelings for Richard. His kindness, his intelligence, his complete devotion to what he believed was his family made it increasingly difficult for her to remember that none of this rightfully belonged to her. Meanwhile, the real Sarah was being held in a warehouse in Queens, the victim of a kidnapping orchestrated by Victoria Sterling and executed by professionals who specialized in making people disappear without a trace. The emergency foundation meeting had been a ruse to get her away from the security of the estate, and she had been taken from the parking garage of the Midtown office building where the meeting was supposedly to take place. "No one knows you're missing yet," Victoria explained during one of her visits to the warehouse. "Your dear husband thinks you're at home, playing the devoted wife and mother. By the time anyone realizes you're gone, I'll have convinced Richard that you abandoned him and Emma for reasons of your own." "Richard will never believe that," Sarah said, though fear was making her voice shake. "He knows I would never leave Emma." "Perhaps not. But he'll believe it when your identical twin sister tells him that you've been having doubts about your marriage, that you've been struggling with the pressures of your new life, that you need some time away to think." The revelation that her kidnapper knew about Samantha hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had always wondered whether she might have siblings, but learning about her twin under these circumstances filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror. Victoria's plan was more elaborate than Sarah had initially realized. While Samantha continued to pose as Sarah, growing more attached to the life she was inhabiting each day, David Rodriguez was being encouraged to file legal papers challenging Richard's adoption of Emma. The combination of a missing wife and a custody battle would be enough to destroy Richard's reputation and force him to retreat from the public life that Victoria was determined to share with him. But Victoria had underestimated both Samantha's growing conscience and Richard's intuitive understanding of the woman he loved. As the second week of the deception began, Richard started noticing subtle differences in his wife's behavior, small changes in the way she held Emma, different preferences in food and music, an unfamiliarity with shared memories that should have been precious to both of them. "Tell me about the night Emma was born," Richard said during dinner one evening, studying Samantha's face carefully. Samantha felt panic rise in her throat as she realized she had no specific memories to draw upon, only the general information Victoria had provided about Sarah's life. "What do you want to know?" she asked, buying time to think. "What did I say when I first held her? What was the first thing you noticed about her?" The questions were tests, Richard realized, designed to confirm the growing suspicion that the woman sitting across from him was not his wife. When Samantha's answers were vague and generic, rather than filled with the specific emotional details that would have been seared into Sarah's memory, Richard knew with certainty that something was very wrong. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, his voice heavy with disappointment and concern. "And what have you done with my wife?" The confrontation that followed was painful for both of them. Samantha broke down completely, confessing not only her identity, but her growing love for the life she had been living, and her terror at the thought of losing Emma, whom she had come to think of as her own daughter. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she sobbed. "I was supposed to reveal myself after a few days, but everything here is so perfect, so beautiful. I've never had a family, never had anyone who cared whether I came home at night. I know it's wrong, but I can't bear the thought of going back to my old life." Richard's anger at being deceived was tempered by recognition of Samantha's desperate longing for belonging. But his primary concern was for Sarah's welfare, and Samantha's revelations about Victoria Sterling's involvement in the deception filled him with a cold fury that surprised him with its intensity. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Where is Sarah?" Working together, Richard and Samantha developed a plan to expose Victoria's scheme and rescue Sarah. The plan required Samantha to continue her impersonation for a few more days, while Richard gathered evidence of Victoria's involvement and located the warehouse where Sarah was being held. The rescue itself was a carefully coordinated operation involving private security personnel and local law enforcement. When they broke down the warehouse doors, they found Sarah weak but unharmed. Her relief at seeing Richard so profound that she collapsed into his arms with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. But Victoria Sterling's arrest was only the beginning of the revelations that would reshape all their lives. Under interrogation, she revealed the full extent of her scheme, including her manipulation of David Rodriguez and her promises to help him gain custody of Emma. The custody hearing that followed was a painful ordeal that exposed Sarah's past in all its harsh detail. David's lawyers painted a picture of an unfit mother who had abandoned her child to pursue a wealthy husband, while Victoria's recorded statements about Sarah's character were used to question her stability and motives. But Richard's legal team was equally prepared, presenting evidence of David's abandonment of Sarah during her pregnancy and his complete absence from Emma's life until he learned of her connection to wealth. More importantly, they presented testimony from Samantha, who had spent 2 weeks living as Sarah and could speak to the kind of mother and wife Sarah truly was. "I pretended to be my sister for 14 days, Samantha testified. "In that time, I saw how Emma responded to what she thought was her mother's presence. That child knows who loves her, who cares for her, who has been there every night when she was frightened or sick. Sarah Mitchell Harrison is Emma's mother in every way that matters, and Richard Harrison is her father. David Rodriguez is a stranger who shares some DNA. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. David's parental rights were terminated permanently, Richard's adoption was confirmed as legally binding, and Emma would remain where she belonged, with the family who had loved and cared for her from the beginning. But the damage to Richard and Sarah's marriage was significant. The revelation that Samantha had developed intimate feelings for Richard during her deception, and that those feelings had been partially reciprocated before Richard understood the truth, created a rift between the spouses that seemed impossible to bridge. "How can I trust what I feel for you when I spent 2 weeks believing I was feeling it for someone else?" Richard asked during one of their painful conversations. "How can you forgive me for not knowing immediately that you had been replaced?" The separation that followed was temporary but heartbreaking for both of them. Sarah moved into the guest house with Emma, while Richard remained in the main house, both of them trying to process the trauma they had experienced and decide whether their marriage could survive such fundamental violations of trust. It was Samantha who ultimately provided the catalyst for their reconciliation. Haunted by guilt over her role in nearly destroying her sister's happiness, she spent weeks documenting every detail of Victoria's manipulative scheme. Her investigation uncovered evidence of other crimes Victoria had committed, other lives she had damaged in pursuit of her own desires. "I want to make this public," Samantha told Sarah during one of their tentative conversations as they worked to build a relationship as sisters. "I want everyone to know what Victoria Sterling did to you, to your marriage, to Emma. She destroyed families and manipulated people's lives, and she should face consequences." The plan they developed was audacious in its scope. Working together, Sarah and Samantha arranged for Victoria's recorded confessions to be played during a major charity gala, ensuring that her crimes would be exposed in front of the very social circle she had tried so hard to impress. The evening of the Metropolitan Children's Foundation's annual gala was one Victoria had been anticipating for months. With Sarah presumably out of the picture and Richard's marriage in shambles, she believed her path back into his life was finally clear. But when the evening's program included a special presentation about family bonds and the lengths people would go to protect those they loved, Victoria realized too late that she had walked into a trap. Her own voice filled the ballroom, recounting in damning detail every aspect of her scheme to destroy Sarah's marriage and steal Emma from her parents. The recording was followed by a live presentation from Sarah and Samantha, appearing together for the first time in public and telling the story of how Victoria's obsession had nearly destroyed multiple lives. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony compelling, and Victoria's arrest in front of New York's social elite was the final chapter in her fall from grace. In the aftermath of Victoria's public exposure and legal conviction, Richard and Sarah began the slow process of rebuilding their marriage. The trauma they had experienced had revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities in their relationship, but it had also demonstrated the depth of their commitment to each other and to Emma. The renewal of their wedding vows took place exactly 1 year after Victoria's conviction, in the same garden where they had first pledged their love to each other. This time, the ceremony was smaller, more intimate, focused on the promises they were making rather than the social expectations they were fulfilling. Emma, now walking and babbling in the way that suggested her first words weren't far away, served as an honorary witness, her presence a reminder of the love that had brought her parents together and sustained them through their darkest moments. Samantha was there too, having found her own path to happiness with a man she had met during the legal proceedings surrounding Victoria's trial. She had chosen to remain in New York, building a relationship with the sister she had never known, and the niece who had captured her heart during those confusing weeks when she had pretended to be someone else. "I promise to trust you with my whole heart," Sarah said, as she looked into Richard's eyes, speaking the vows they had written together. "I promise to see you clearly, to know you completely, and to love you exactly as you are. I promise to protect what we've built together," Richard replied, his voice steady, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "I promise to choose you every day, in every circumstance, for as long as we both shall live." As they kissed to seal their renewed commitment, surrounded by people who had supported them through their trials, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been searching for family her entire life, never knowing that she would find it in the most unexpected way, through kindness offered to a stranger, through love that survived deception and betrayal, through the simple recognition that home isn't a place, but a person willing to build a life with you. The star-shaped birthmark on Emma's neck, which had started this entire journey of discovery, caught the light as Richard lifted his daughter into his arms. It was no longer a symbol of mystery or separation, but of connection, of the beautiful ways that love can bind people together across time and circumstance. As the evening celebration continued around them, the Harrison family stood together in their garden, surrounded by the life they had built through determination, forgiveness, and the understanding that sometimes the most precious things come disguised as the most difficult challenges.